Now, the other day I made a video talking about how Jon Favreau as well as Dave Filoni had made some comments about how The Mandalorian was going to expand and get bigger in Season 2 as well as into future seasons. And at one point, Favreau even kind of compared it to Game of Thrones, implying that it might follow multiple character storylines instead of just strictly following The Mandalorian himself, as Season 1 had. And it didn't really surprise me to hear that the show would get bigger and expand as it went on. Pretty much all shows of this nature do. But hearing him compare it to Game of Thrones was a little curious, considering that's a radically different approach or format from the first season, where virtually everything, barring a few small scenes, was told from the perspective of just one character, which was of course the Mandalorian himself. Instead then, we would then have no true main character perhaps, but rather a host of centralized characters that have mostly separate yet somewhat intertwined stories that form or eventually mesh into a much larger narrative overall. Which is a rather interesting style to adopt when you have a show named The Mandalorian, implying a singular main character, and after the first season again was almost strictly from his perspective, and it was also a style that most viewers seemed to really enjoy. And though sure, if in the future from time to time they wanted to switch to some other points of view for more than just a brief scene here and there, I think that would certainly be fine. In fact, it'd be downright difficult to make the story bigger without doing that occasionally. Anyway, here it turns out there might be another reason for what Favreau said the other day, why the show will be switching formats, and that apparently halfway through Season 2 we'll be seeing some sort of major shift away from The Mandalorian and onto other characters. And before getting too deep into it, this rumor or report comes from Grace Randolph, who I'm not overly familiar with, but after looking into it, seems she is a rather reliable source and has nailed or broke plenty of other stories just like this one in the past. So though no, none of this can be 100% verified, it does seem like she often gets this sort of thing right, and doesn't just throw something out there unless she's very sure about her sources. So all that said, apparently the problem all boils down to Pedro Pascal, the actor who plays the Mandalorian, wanting to do more scenes with the helmet off in Season 2, but the creative team, I'm assuming Favreau and or Filoni, wouldn't budge on this issue. He also seemingly complained about having to wear the suit itself, that it's extremely uncomfortable, which isn't surprising. And he got increasingly difficult about all of this as filming went on, until he finally went to Lucasfilm and complained, and at that point the creative team told him to just go home, and so he did. Which now means that somewhere around the midpoint of Season 2, the focus has to shift away from the Mandalorian and onto other characters since Pedro Pascal was gone, and that he will be sprinkled in here and there to make it less noticeable to us, the audience. And there is no word on whether or not this is a permanent split or if they can work this all out and Pedro Pascal will return for Season 3 and then beyond. Okay, so kind of giving my thoughts on this, I can pretty much understand and sympathize with the frustration of Pedro Pascal here. He's starring in this big time show and he'd like to be seen from time to time. Though yeah, it does sound a little egotistical, but if it's as uncomfortable in that suit as I'd imagine it is, I'm sure part of it is he just would like to do a little bit of work outside of it from time to time, or at least without the helmet on. Though I've also heard that he's not in the suit a lot of the time anyway, that he has a couple stunt doubles that do quite a bit of the work. Regardless, the problem here, on many levels, is that the show is called The Mandalorian, which means Pedro Pascal should have known, and apparently he did know according to these reports, well in advance that he was pretty much always going to be in the armor, and that the helmet does not come off. That a big part of the character or story is that he doesn't reveal his face to anyone, with the one exception to this being in Season 1 where he revealed it to the droid IG-11. However here, though never removing the helmet and no one having seen his face since he was a boy is certainly an interesting facet or aspect of the character, it's one that doesn't exist anywhere else in Mandalorian lore. And even as recently in the timeline as the show Rebels, which is about 10 years before The Mandalorian takes place, and would be many years after Din Djarin was found during the Clone Wars and became a foundling, we see plenty of Mandalorians freely taking their helmets off whenever, wherever, and in front of whoever. And speaking of the Clone Wars, it seems that Din Djarin was found by members of Clan Vizsla and or Death Watch, as the insignia on the one who rescued him kind of implies. And they are, of course, one of the groups of Mandalorians often seen in the Clone Wars that we've literally seen frequently removing their helmets in front of others. Though yes, there is likely or will be some sort of explanation given for this discrepancy, that perhaps he was found by some sort of separate or more extreme offshoot of Mandalorians that follow an older code, perhaps one where they don't remove their helmets. Either way, going back to the problem of this show being called The Mandalorian, the real interesting question here is, if Pedro Pascal is done for good, what exactly do they do with the show? I mean, in theory, The Mandalorian could refer to any Mandalorian, so you could technically replace him with another Mandalorian. Or you could just, I guess, ever so subtly put an S at the end of the name and change the show to The Mandalorians, which would start in season 3, and then you could expand, making it more like Game of Thrones, like they said. I guess it could also just stay as The Mandalorian, and where he, Din Djarin, set in motion some big changes for their people after whatever the Great Purge technically is, so you can just keep that name as a way to show how important he was to everything that happens henceforth, even though he himself is no longer a part of the series. Or I suppose you could just recast him, or just recast the voice really, get someone who sounds very, very similar to Pedro Pascal, and if the helmet doesn't come off ever again, it doesn't technically matter who's underneath it, so they could get anyone to play that part, and as I said, they already have stunt doubles doing a lot of the work anyway. Though the problem there, and maybe the true irony of this whole thing, is eventually, or so I would think, you would want the helmet to come off. You will want him to reveal his face to somebody at some point in this series. All I know here is, if true, and again the source does seem reliable, is that this is yet another Star Wars project with trouble going on behind the scenes. Though to be fair, a lot of productions, of course, have problems that we usually never hear about, and Star Wars just tends to be under a larger microscope, more so than other franchises or shows. In any case, we'll eventually be able to see in the next few months, actually, since this season is set to kick off October 30th, how true or not any of this really is. Because if things do shift away from The Mandalorian around mid-season, we'll know this is likely pretty legit. And if he doesn't return for season 3 at all, we'll have it basically confirmed at that point. Though I'm sure we'll be given some sort of other excuse that it was a mutual parting and there's no hard feelings or anything like that. And again here, if true, maybe the most curious question of all will be, what characters will get the focus shifted onto them midway through season 2? Will it be ones we've already seen before, like Cara Dune and or Greef Karga perhaps? Or some new ones we've yet to meet and know nothing about? Or could it even be the likes of Ahsoka or perhaps Boba Fett, who are of course both rumored to be in this season? I mean, it is curious to note that the news about them being in season 2 didn't break until after season 2 had wrapped filming, which could potentially mean one or both of them were brought in pretty late after the problems with Pedro Pascal had escalated and he left the show, and they wanted to use a big name character to distract people from the lack of actual Mandalorian in the back half of the season. So could we then see something crazy like Ahsoka taking the child in search of his home planet, or even taking him or looking for Luke Skywalker to possibly train him? Sure, that's highly unlikely, but that would certainly be a heck of a distraction, and if this is true, who knows exactly what they'll do with the second half of the season. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of all this. If it's true, if Pedro Pascal is indeed gone, what do you think should be done with this show? Or maybe you don't believe any of it, and again, depending on how season 2 goes, we'll likely see if there is or isn't any truth to it. Either way, do leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.